Madam President and fellow delegates, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Let me say right from the start that my intention in these brief remarks that I will make is to address you all as a historian speaking to fellow historians and speaking about some of the anxieties that many of us have had about what is happening to the discipline of history. History, in a sense, seems to be at the crossroads. There are the professional historians and their research, which is often brilliant, stunning, and taking history in new directions, new ways of explaining the past. But that somehow doesn't seem to reach the general public. And the general public is frequently fed, and increasingly so, on stories that claim to be history, but in fact are the fantasy of a few people. And this is done through television, the social media, and controlling the content of textbooks. Textbooks have been and are very central to this debate since the last 50-odd years. But I would like to emphasize the fact that it is no longer possible for untrained people not trained in the methods of historical research, to write acceptable history, because history today is very different from what it was 100 or even 50 years ago. It requires a method that involves training, and it involves a method that involves testing the evidence and analyzing the historical sources. A century ago, a variety of people claimed to write history. There were, of course, the professional historians, the teachers of history in universities, but there were many others who were lawyers, politicians, doctors, engineers, what have you. And in those days, history was relatively easy to write because you quoted the text and you got your information and put it together. But today, it is far more difficult, because one has to follow a method of historical research, and a method which is based on what we all call critical inquiry. And that method, that critical inquiry has to be made clear to the general public, that not anybody and everybody can get up and say this is history. You have to prove that you have used the historical method. You have to prove the reliability of the evidence that you are using. You have to prove that you're using a wide range of sources, as many sources as are relevant to the subject that you are researching on. Let me give you one example, a very, very controversial example that is being talked about today. Let us take the Vedic period of ancient history. In the old days, you had to know Sanskrit, and you have to read the texts and simply say that such and such a Vedic text says this, and that went into the making of history. But today, in addition to knowing not just classical Sanskrit, you have to be familiar with Vedic Sanskrit, which is rather different, as the great grammarian Panini pointed out. You have to know some archaeology, and if you're going to talk about disappearance or the appearance of rivers like the Saraswati, you have to know something about hydrology. And finally, if you're going to talk about migrations and origins, did the Aryans originate in India? Did they come from outside? You have to also be familiar with the work that is being done on DNA and genetics. Now, one historian cannot handle all these different approaches to knowledge about a particular historical period, so there is resort now to much more teamwork you get into conversations with people and you understand them. The crucial test also is that the genuine historian does not claim that he or she is telling you the truth about what happened. We can't really ever know, as historians, the truth, the absolute truth of what happened in the past. We can't go back to the past, we can't demonstrate the past. But what we can do, and that is what the genuine historian does, is to explain what happened in the past, or to try and explain. And explanations keep on changing as more and more evidence is discovered, as new methods of inquiry are brought into play. So this is a very big difference in the sense that we are concerned with explaining what happened in the past. Now, every society, anywhere in the world, represents its past in different ways. It may do so through epic literature, it may do so through chronicles, it may do so through biographies, and so on. And in the earlier days, one just quoted these texts, and that was enough to make history. But today, the text that you use has to be put into context, into historical context, and tested for reliability. Therefore, what we do is to question the text, to cross-check the text. And what do I mean by this? We ask the question, who is the author? Because if the author is a Shrotriya Brahmana, he will have a very different approach to a subject from, let us say, a Kayast who's writing in Prakrit, or a Buddhist or a Jain monk who's also writing about the same subject. So who is the author? What are his credentials? What caste does he belong to? What occupation does he carry out? Where is he located? Which region does he come from? What is his background? Does his background influence the kind of writing that he is doing? And finally, the very important question, what is the agenda or the intention of the author in writing the text that he has written? The question of agenda, of intention, is a very fundamental question when one is looking at a text. And this is why the sub-discipline of historiography has become very important, because you have to consider the intellectual context of the text and the author. Then you have the Sanskrit sources, which very few historians until recently referred to. And that again is an interesting question. Why is it that for the history of the second millennium AD, the Persian sources and the Turkish sources are readily referred to, but very few people referred to the Sanskrit sources, which are now, of course, coming into use. The Sanskrit sources have a difference of opinion between the Shaiva priest, Bhava Brihaspati, who says he was responsible for the rebuilding of the temple by Kumarapal Solanki, and the Jain Sanskrit chronicles, the famous Prabandha Chintamani of Merutunga of the 13th century, who says it is the Jain minister who was responsible in persuading Kumarapala to rebuild the temple. And what is interesting about these Sanskrit sources is none of them refer to Mahmud of Ghazni. They say that the temple got dilapidated because of mismanagement or lack of management by the ministers, the Kumantri, and by the fact that the temple was on the shore of the sea and the sea waves kept hitting the temple and the stone degenerated through weathering. Now, these are important issues, that you have a set of sources in which there isn't agreement as to what happened, when it happened, what was the result. And the British, of course, the colonial writers, pick up the Persian chronicles and elaborate on the story of the destruction of the temple and the icon, and introduce the idea in the House of Commons about the trauma that the Hindus underwent when Mahmud attacked the temple. Now, the historian, therefore, is not concerned primarily with saying this version is true and this version is not true. The historian is concerned with explaining why there are these different versions. Why should there be these different versions, and which version is more likely to have been closer to what actually happened? And that is very different from saying that the temple was destroyed, the icon was destroyed by so-and-so, and that is the truth. So there is this shade of difference of opinion which is extremely important in historical writing. Talking about sources and archaeological sources, one of the most interesting changes that has taken place, which the general public is unaware of, is the discovery of what we now call maritime history and maritime trade. This is largely archaeological because although it has been referred to, the Indian Ocean as a center of trade, as an area where trade was extensive, is referred to in the texts, but it is only with the archaeological discovery of a series of sites from the Red Sea to southern Arabian coasts, to East Africa, to the west coast of India, the east coast of India, across to Southeast Asia. There suddenly has emerged in the last 50 years the possibility of talking about the perspective from the Indian Ocean of the peninsula. So you have the land perspective of the subcontinent, you have the Indian Ocean perspective as well. The land looking at the sea and the sea looking at the land, as it were. And in this context, of course, a number of the sites are located in the coastlines of the Indian peninsula. Places like Arikamedu, which was first excavated, and places like Pattanam, which is being currently excavated. Modern historical writing in India began with colonial interpretations of Indian history, which we inherited as historians, and in which there was much debate in the past 20th century. Two ideas that have been very dominant and influential have been, first of all, Mill's idea of a two-nation theory, that the Hindus and the Muslims constituted two independent nations in the past and were therefore always hostile to each other. This theory led to the emergence, amongst other factors, but the historical basis of this theory led to, the presumed historical basis led to Hindu religious nationalism and Muslim religious nationalism. Now, as I have said earlier, some people don't call these nationalisms, but they call themselves nationalisms, so I'm using the term in that sense. Both of them, Hindu religious nationalism and Muslim religious nationalism, accepted and adopted the colonial interpretation of Indian history. The anti-colonial Indian nationalism, which was different, did question some of these ideas, but the other two, the religious nationalisms, tended to support the ideas much more closely. What do the historians have to say about this? The last 1,000 years is in fact a period when there was a great development of the Sanskrit language, Sanskrit literature, commentaries on the Sanskrit texts. Sayana's commentary on the Rig Veda dates to the 14th century. There are commentaries on the Dharma Shastras, as the famous Kuluka commentary. There are commentaries on the epics, the Ramayana in particular. Century after century, right up to the 18th century, people are writing commentaries in Sanskrit. There are translations of works from Sanskrit into Persian, where the Jain scholars of Sanskrit and the Brahmin scholars of Sanskrit at the court of the Mughals are sitting and supervising these translations from Sanskrit into Persian. There is a great efflorescence, a flowering of the Hindu religion. Remember that all the bhakti movements and the bhakti sects all belong to this period, and there is a tremendous discussion in philosophical circles about religion and about philosophies. And the Hindus also are employed in the higher levels of administration. The financiers were often Hindus, and the generals of the Mughal army were known to be, among them were known to be Rajputs. So how can one say that this was a period in which the Hindus were victimized? And I must confess that every time this statement is made, I always feel like getting up and saying to the person who makes the statement, whom unfortunately one cannot always address, I feel like saying, what about coming to terms with the fact that for 2,000 years it was the Hindus who victimized the lower caste, the Dalits, the Adivasis. If we're talking about victimization, let's be clear as to who was victimizing whom. The other question, the other theory that came out of colonial scholarship, which is now very current, equally current as the two-nation theory, was Max Muller and the Theosophists, who argued that the Aryans were the foundation of Hindu culture and therefore of Indian culture. And now, of course, there is an absolute obsession with trying to find out the origin of the Aryans. The Sanskrit texts are being read again and again and again. Archaeology is trying to push back the boundaries to first it was 4,000, then it was 5,000. Now I believe the current date is 7,000 BC. And this is all an attempt to try and prove that the Aryans were indigenous, that the Aryans were the original Hindus, and everything followed as in accordance with the Hindu religion after that. My problem is that is the origin of a group which we cannot even define very clearly. We don't really know who were the Aryans. Were there a people? Was it a language group? Or was it a religious group? We have no idea really definitively as to who the Aryans were. Is it really all that important to go on and on talking about their origin? Isn't it equally important, if not more important, to talk about how was this culture created? What went into the making of this culture? And what influence did this culture have on other cultures of later periods? That seems to me to be a much more pertinent historical question than to go on and on saying, where did they originate? Today's historians, as unlike 50 years ago, don't just quote sources, but they also analyze them. This is a crucial difference between now and a century ago. And this is one reason why historical interpretations keep on changing, and they will change. They will continue to change, because as new sources are discovered, 100 years ago there was no such thing as DNA and genetics, so nobody was studying the Aryans from a genetic point of view. Today they're trying to do so. Whatever the results are debatable, but nevertheless they are trying to use different kind of source. So that this kind of change will continue, and most of the explanations that we are seeking are how societies of the past functioned. What were their state systems? Were they chiefships? Were they types of kingdoms? Were they empires? What were their economic patterns in society, in thinking? And particularly changes that were initiated through education, in making education necessary to the understanding of knowledge, of existing knowledge, and necessary to the advance of knowledge. And amongst these changes in education, I would call two, and emphasize two, which I think are very, very important. One is encouraging students and researchers and ourselves, not just students, to ask questions. Questions are fundamental to all research, to all logical and reasoned thought. Questions are at the root of understanding existing knowledge and advancing knowledge in the future. Only those with closed minds don't ask questions and go on to say it's anti-national to ask questions. This is, if I may say so, absolute nonsense, because everything in life is based on asking questions, and some questions have to be more carefully directed towards seeking the solutions and explaining problems. Fortunately, we have a very strong tradition in our history of philosophy of people asking questions. You may say that in the Upanishads, which is essentially, these are texts essentially based on asking questions. They're constantly asking questions. Are they anti-national? You have a whole tradition of thinking and asking of questions among groups like the Charvaka, the Buddhists, the Jains, which are generally called the Shramanic groups, the schools of philosophy in which logic is extremely important, like Sankhya. These are all philosophical schools given to asking questions. So asking questions is crucial. But there is something else, the second point I want to make. Questions can only be asked in conditions where there is freedom to think in alternate and different ways. There has to be the freedom to think in a liberated way and to express one's thoughts in a liberated way. The Upanishads did allow you to ask questions and did record the questions you were asking and some of the discussion. And the Buddhists and Jains in turn recorded what questions they were asking and the discussions that followed. So it's an old tradition which we should maintain, preserve, and keep going. 50 years ago, all this existed, even in our own times. I remember as a student being told, well, more than 50 years ago, being told, you must ask questions of your text, otherwise you're not doing research. And that was part of the reason why historical research flourished and new ideas in history came in and changed in many ways the ways in which we were looking at history. That space for the freedom to think and to question and ask reasons, that is beginning to shrink. It's not only beginning to shrink, it has shrunk. There are demands for books to be banned, there are demands for chapters of books to be expunged, there's interference in the courses and the contents of syllabi, both at school and in university. And the catch-all phrase by which this is being justified is constantly to say that not to do so, that to concede the asking of questions and to concede the freedom of thought is to concede anti-nationalism. So we have to be very careful about how we relate to these kinds of demands and how we relate to what goes into the making of free, liberated history. And if you stop inquiry, if you say no more questions, no more free thought, that puts an end to all discussion and debate. Yet, asking questions and freely debating the answers are exactly what universities are meant for. We had problems in colonial times when the British educational system was very careful not to allow the writings, for example, of Tom Paine to be discussed in university courses. Or when the famous play of Shakuntala was translated into English, Monia Williams sat down and said, we will cut out all these passages because they're too erotic to be taught in college. This was censorship. And this is something we have picked up from colonial times. We tried to annul it, we tried to push it aside. In the last 50 years, it is now creeping back, and we have to be very careful. This tradition of questioning, this tradition of speaking freely and seeking solutions is something that is essential to our professional life, in any profession, not just historians. In any profession, you have to learn how to ask questions, how to ask relevant questions. And the control of this is beginning to affect many of our institutes of learning. University systems begin to get attacked and are slowly being dismantled. Now, because history is thought of, as it was in early days, as an easy subject, you just quote the text and there's your history, those in authority think that they can interfere and dictate what is correct history and who is to write it. And this is something that we as professional historians, independent historians, have to resist. It becomes essential, therefore, and I will conclude with these words, it becomes essential for us as historians to protect our discipline, to protect the right to ask questions, to indulge in the freedom of thought, and to protect our autonomy to do so. This is terribly, terribly important, because once we give in on this, then our history will be rubbished. And if we are to preserve a decent, respectable, intellectual attempt at understanding the past, we have to protect the discipline and our autonomy. But at the same time, let me add that my experience of the last 50 years or so does make it clear that we also have to inform public opinion about the research we are doing, the explanations that we are finding, the consequences of the explanations. In other words, like all knowledge, whether it is scientific, social scientific, humanitarian, all knowledge is for those who discover the knowledge, but then to be passed on to the people from whose society that knowledge has been conceived and that knowledge has taken shape. And I hope that gatherings like this will reinforce the idea of protecting the discipline, protecting our autonomy, and also emphasizing the conveyance, the communication of new knowledge to the public at large. Thank you.